Hello. In this video, we will be going over informed consent, which is a legal and ethical requirement. The objectives of this video are to explain what's involved in the informed consent process and to describe the basic content of an informed consent document. Informed consent, what is it? In a nutshell, informed consent involves the right of clients to be informed about their therapy and make autonomous decisions pertaining to it. Okay, so AMPT says that marriage and family therapists obtain appropriate informed consent to therapy or related procedures and use language that's reasonably understandable to clients. A client can't provide you informed consent if they're not informed, meaning that they don't understand what they're doing, right? You haven't explained the process of therapy in a way that the client is going to be able to truly understand what they're getting into and agree to it. So it needs to have reasonably understandable language. Another important thing is that similar to confidentiality, informed consent is not a single event. It's best viewed as a process that continues through the duration of therapy when issues or questions arise. So for example, if a client is struggling with understanding the point of therapy after they've been seeing you for a little while, or they feel like they're not benefiting, informed consent would say that you are going to discuss with them again their expectations for therapy, risks and benefits of therapy, and so on, to make sure that they're making an autonomous, informed decision about whether or not they want to continue in treatment with you. It's not just something you do at the beginning of therapy. Okay? Best practice for informed consent involves providing information about the process of therapy for the client, both verbally, speaking, explaining, and in writing in an informed consent document. And most agencies utilize a document. Okay? According to the law, you don't actually have to get a signed informed consent form, okay? But this is only for adults. So for children, minors, you must have a signed consent form by law. For adults, you don't have to have a signed consent form by law. You just have to report in your documentation that you went over informed consent with the client. I do want to put a caveat here, though, is that best practice is to get it signed, regardless of the age of the client. Okay, so informed about what? What are we informing the client about in this informed consent document? We want to inform the client about any significant information concerning treatment processes and procedures. So this includes things like your fee for service, expectations for therapy, confidentiality and situations where you might breach confidentiality, alternative treatments like self-help, bibliotherapy, things like that. Anytime that you're going to need to consult with colleagues. So if you're a trainee, for example, informed consent should include something in there about how you're under the license of a supervisor, and you'll be discussing the case with your supervisor. Okay. Other things might be like cancellation policies, late fees, and so on. Okay, so anything related to processes and procedures of therapy. You also want to make sure that the client is agreeing to therapy without being coerced or forced into that agreement. So we want them to freely agree to participate in therapy, knowing everything they need to know about it. There are some legal components that need to be inside your informed consent document or explained verbally. Okay? First off, it needs to be given in clear language in a culturally sensitive manner. Okay? As I've already mentioned, it needs to include by law something about your fees and how the fee was set, something about the status of your license. Are you a trainee? Are you an associate? Are you licensed? If you're an associate, you should provide your registrant number. If you're licensed, you should provide your license number. If you're using any kind of technology like email, text messaging, you're using like an electronic billing system, that should be in your informed consent. If you're a HIPAA-covered entity, you also must include the notice of privacy practices. And finally, legally, the informed consent needs to be voluntarily given, meaning that you didn't force a client to sign it. Okay, what about ethical components and standard of care components? So quick note about this. So even though these are ethical and standard of care components, you could argue that these are legal components too. So don't get too hung up on what's legal, what's ethical in this case. So limits of confidentiality should be discussed and reviewed over the course of treatment. If you sense that a client is about to disclose something that might be a mandated breach, like they're starting to talk about disciplining their child and it's sounding a little bit abusive potentially, you want to remind them of the limits of confidentiality so they can make an autonomous decision about whether or not to continue to share with you. Risks and benefits of treatment are already covered. Alternative treatment options, as I mentioned, self-help, bibliotherapy, group therapy, so on. Your cancellation policy and billing procedures. Are you going to charge them if they cancel? How are you going to submit billing? Are you going to do it through insurance, electronically? What are you going to do? Emergency practices. So what do they do if they're in crisis? Do they contact you? Do you have a on-call line? Do they call 911? What should they do? And it's also good practice to include a little bit about your background. What's your approach to therapy? What's your education like? And so on. There are a couple of things that are unique to couples, families, and groups that have to do with informed consent. First off, ethically, we should include what's called the no secrets policy in our informed consent. And what this means is that when you have a treatment unit that is more than one person, like a couple, family, or group, you want to inform the entire treatment unit that you will not hold secrets between clients. So if one of the members of your couple calls you on the phone and says, oh my gosh, I just cheated on my husband, please don't tell him. I really just need to talk about it with you. You don't want to be in a position where you now have to hold this secret and keep it from your other client, which would not be in his best interest. So at the onset of therapy, you want to inform the clients that you do not hold secrets between them. And if they share information with you, you will share it with the rest of the treatment unit. That's the no secrets policy. Legally and ethically, all adults must provide consent, informed consent. Remember, it can be verbal for adults, but it must be signed for children under 18. Ethically, group consent, so consent in group therapy, should also inform them of the inherent risk that there is due to there being other group members that aren't held to the same standard of confidentiality as you. So even though you can't breach confidentiality outside of mandated breaches situations, others in the group are not held to that same standard and may very well go and discuss everything that came up in group with someone else. So we want to let our clients know that at the beginning so they can make an informed choice about whether or not to share. Special cases. So consent for video and audio taping must be written. So this is it's seen as having higher risk, and so it's in addition to your regular informed consent, you must have a written consent for audio taping or videotaping of clients, meaning it must be signed. Also, we have to treat with informed consent in all cases, except in a crisis situation. So if a client comes to see you and the first thing that comes out of their mouth is that they're suicidal, you can put aside the informed consent component to address the immediate crisis. But as soon as you've resolved it, you have to get informed consent. Okay, this is why before you ask a client what brought you to therapy, you should go over everything related to informed consent so that they know how things are going to work, they know about the limits of confidentiality and so on, and you don't find yourself in a position where you are having to, call for a 5150 or you're having to, contact their emergency person or what have you without them knowing this is what you were going to do because you didn't go over limits of confidentiality. Okay. Now, informed consent for minors is a bit of a unique thing, and it can get a little complicated. So we're going to go over what that looks like and who should sign and so on. Okay, so legal requirements. I've already mentioned this a couple times. Informed consent for minors must be signed. For adults, it doesn't have to be. Minors has to be. If the child is 12 or older, they may consent for their own treatment without a parent or guardian if they're considered mature enough to do so, one. And two, there's a justifiable reason not to include their parents. So for example, if the client tells you that their parents are completely against therapy and that they would prevent them from coming to get treatment, that would be a justifiable reason to not include the parents and to allow the client to sign their own consent, assuming they're mature enough to do so. One important thing to keep in mind here, if the minor is signing for their own treatment, they are responsible for payment. So they wouldn't be able necessarily to use their parents' insurance if the parent didn't consent to treatment. So that's important. Okay? You as the therapist must make contact with the minor's parents in any other situation. So unless you can document reasons why contacting the parents could be detrimental to the client, or there's a good enough, a justifiable reason to not include them, then it is your responsibility to reach out to the parents and have them sign the informed consent. If a parent or guardian brings the child in, the parent or guardian must sign the informed consent form on behalf of the child, and the child can sign the assent form, but they're not legally required to. All right, so where things, as I mentioned, get complicated is who signs. In the case of a parent or guardian bringing the minor in, or a minor who's under 12, who signs the consent for treatment? And it depends on the relationship status of the parents. If the parents are married, either parent can sign, meaning that both don't have to. If the parents have never been married, again, either parent can sign, both don't have to. If the parents have been married before and are divorced, then you must consult the custody agreement and determine who has legal custody or who has custody over mental health decisions, and that person must sign. And you can't just take their word for it. You must have the documentation. If both parents in this case have legal custody, then they both must sign. What about with foster children where we don't have a traditional parent? If there's a legal guardian who's been assigned to the foster child, the legal guardian can sign the consent for treatment. If they have a caregiver, so not a legal guardian, but a caregiver, the caregiver can sign what's called a caregiver affidavit, saying that they're the caregiver and saying that they've been given permission to sign for the client, and that can act as your informed consent. Otherwise, if a child is in foster care, for example, then their attorney must sign the consent unless the court has issued a minute order for the foster parent or the social worker to sign that gives them permission, essentially, to sign on behalf of the child. Okay. And the last one here, the last complicated one, if there's a court order in the case of a foster child, if there's a court order for mental health services, meaning that in the minutes it says that this child must receive mental health services, then that acts as your consent for treatment. And you don't really need to do very much more beyond that. And that allows the foster parent to sign. Okay, so this is a little chart that I created to kind of lay all of this out a bit. Oops. Because it can be complicated. And so up at the top are the different types of clients you might encounter. And then on the left, it asks, is informed consent required? And you can see that across the board, it's yes, because you have to provide informed consent, right? At least verbally. So yes, no matter the client, informed consent, absolutely. The second line is signed consent required. And this is where it depends, right? So if it's an adult, then technically no, but any minor child, yes, you have to get it signed. And then who must sign for these minor clients? And I give you those answers. And then at the very bottom, special circumstances, like with the minor client, who has legal custody, were the parents married, and so on. Okay, so I'll be uploading this chart into Canvas for you so you have a PDF version of it, but I wanted to present it here for you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be breaking here to show you a video that has to do with teen pregnancy, and then we'll respond to some questions about informed consent as they relate to it. So give me a second. Okay, so I'm back. We're going to go ahead and watch this video. It's just about a little over a minute.
Well, I just needed to come in and talk to somebody. What were you really wanting to talk about? You look kind of sad.
I just found out that I'm pregnant. And I can't tell my parents.
And how old are you, Suzanne?
I'm 13.
And you don't have anyone to talk to?
No. You're not going to tell my parents, are you?
Well, I think that's something that's up to you to tell your parents, but I
can't tell my parents. They'll kill me. My dad will be so mad at me.
Is there any way maybe we could get your parents to let them know that you're here to see me?
No way. No way.
So they don't know that you're here to see me today?
No. Do you have to tell them? Please don't tell them. I don't have anybody I can talk to. My friends will totally tell my parents. My teachers. I don't know what to do.
All right, so we're going to return to the PowerPoint now. Okay, so after watching that video, let's take a look at some questions here. So the first one, when a minor reports she is pregnant to a counselor, what do we do? And so here are your answer choices. A, law enforcement must be notified immediately. B, a court order is required for counseling to proceed. C, steps should be taken to apply for emancipation. Or D, informed consent of parents or guardians may not be legally required. So take a moment and select what you think is the best answer. Okay, so A, law enforcement must be notified immediately. There's no imminent risk here related to her intending to harm somebody else, which is normally where law enforcement comes into play with homicidal ideation. So that is not the correct answer. B, a court order is required for counseling to proceed. Is not correct. The minor is 13, so technically she can consent to her own treatment in certain circumstances. So we don't have that situation happening here. C, steps should be taken to apply for emancipation. This seems like quite a leap from a client who's sharing about pregnancy, who hasn't expressed necessarily anything about her wanting to emancipate from her parents, so this doesn't seem appropriate. So then that leaves us with D, informed consent of parents or guardians may not be legally required. And this is the correct answer. So in this case, the client really doesn't want you to notify the parents because of whatever reason, and she shares a couple of reasons. And she does seem mature enough to consent for her own treatment. And she's over the age of 12, she's 13, so 12 and over. So in this particular case, given the circumstances surrounding the pregnancy and the concerns the client has expressed and her maturity level, informed consent of her parents may not legally be required for you to provide services. Okay, second one. In California, counselors can provide mental health treatment to minors as young as 12 if the practitioner determines the minors are mature enough to blank outpatient treatment or mental health counseling. So are they mature enough to A, consistently attend, B, change their behavior during treatment, C, participate intelligently, or D, be respectful of? So take a moment. Okay, so while these are all decent answers, what we're getting at here are the legal requirements for providing treatment for a minor without parental consent. Okay, so in this case, for a minor who's 12 and older, we want to make sure that they can participate intelligently in outpatient treatment, meaning that they are mature enough to participate and to give informed consent that's truly informed for themselves. So that would be the correct answer, C, participate intelligently in. Okay, so that's it for the lecture on informed consent. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks for listening.